said, "Oh, you just believe in that escapism. You just want to escape." And I always think of this verse here that Jesus said, talking about the end times. There's three parallel passages in the synoptic gospels, the three that have the same viewpoint. And that is what we call the Olivet Discourse. That's just a theological word, which means the Tuesday night before he went to the cross, he talked about eschatology, end times. It's the only time he directly talked about it. But this verse here is out of that. So watch ye therefore and pray always that you may be accounted worthy to escape. Um, I personally believe worthy means you're in the family. So there are differing opinions, but I don't think there's any particular work you have to do to be worthy. You want to escape all these things that shall come to pass and stand before the Son of Man. So my understanding is that the rapture is going to occur. We're going to escape the 7-year tribulation. And when we're raptured, we're going to stand before him. I believe that's the interpretation of this passage. If you differ, that's fine. Keep in mind that the tribulation is a 7-year period. We're going to see that very soon here in some slides. And the tribulation is a preview of how the earth will look when Satan has total control. So in 2 Corinthians 4:4, Paul writes that Satan is the god of this world. And that's true in terms of the unbelieving world. He's not God over us, but he's God over the unbelieving world. So when you want to know, come on in, yeah, fine, come on in, please. When you want to know, what is it going to look like? What would it look like if Satan had total control over the world? You know, and sometimes I like to think about Hitler and what it looked like then. And I don't think anybody here is old enough to have gone through the Second World War, but there's excellent documentaries, and we've been watching some recently. I love history, and it's pretty amazing how he came to power, and in almost every way he was a type, a foreshadowing of the Antichrist. In fact, many ministers at that time thought he was the Antichrist. Right it is. Okay. So as we go on, I want to just do an introduction, and that is related to what the book of Revelation is. And the book of Revelation is the grand central station of prophecy. In other words, there are many prophecies in the Old Testament. We were reading a part of one from the Olivet Discourse that's in the Gospels, and then Paul also has many scriptures pointing to it. But the Revelation is where all those different divergent streams of prophecy come together, sort of like that great train station in New York, where all these Pennsylvania and New Jersey, all these lines come together into one spot. And so that's what it is. Really, the book of Revelation is a coherent picture of all the prophecies put together in one place. We have all the Old Testament prophecies, and we're going to just briefly touch on some. And we have the gospel prophetic passages, and they're very short because it's only one night of Jesus's ministry. And then we have the Pauline passages, the epistles of Paul mainly, and of course the book of Revelation. In the Old Testament prophecies, we have Daniel. Is actually about 4 books we're just going to quickly hit here. Daniel, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Joel. Joel is used, but in a minor way. So you have your 3 big prophetic prophets, and these are the big prophets, they call them. In other words, they're the big books. So Isaiah is a large book in our Bible. Ezekiel is a large book. And then you have Daniel, it's a large book. And then you have your small prophets. We call them minor prophets, not that they're minor in their impact or importance, but simply because the books are small, compared to the others. So Daniel is a very, very important prophetic book, and he alludes to and mentions some of the very key passages that we're going to study in Revelation, keeping in mind that Daniel wrote his book about 500 years before Jesus. That's a long time. So what was 500 years ago? Anybody help me out? 1600s, I think. So, what do you think was going on here 500 years ago in America? There was the only thing that I can think of from my recent history study is Jamestown. I think it was 1608, something like that, where a plucky group of Protestants came over here and settled a very small settlement. Most all of them died. And that was it. In other words, in terms of the Europeans coming here, um, obviously the conquistadors, the Spanish and even the French and Portuguese, has come over Central and South America. But in other words, 500 years ago, all we had here is one little town, if we can call it that, of the Anglo peoples, and it was settled up there in Boston. So what we have here, I think it was Boston, Jamestown, and maybe it's in Virginia now that I think about it. At any rate, check me out. But what we have here is Daniel speaking about things that would not be written down by John the Apostle for another 2,500 years. I mean, it's hard for us to think about things in these terms. If I go down the street and I see, or I go to a certain part of town, especially if I go to a different area of the country, I may go to a place where I find a building that's 100 years old. If it's a museum type thing, like Williamsburg, I may find a building that's 200, 250 years old, whatever. But in Europe, things are thousands of years old. Has anybody visited Italy and the Colosseum? I have not, but I've seen a lot of documentaries on it. So over there, when you see something that's thousands of years old, it's not a shock. They expect to have that, or in Spain and other places. So, but here, we have a hard time understanding large time frames because we don't have anything around us that goes back forever. You could say, well, the Native Americans were here, yeah, but they didn't build things that lasted. They were a wandering nomadic peoples in general, except for the Pueblos. So anyway, so we in North America do not have much in the way of ancient history. But in this case, John writes and finishes out the prophecy that Daniel started 2,500 years, yea, 2,600 years earlier, because he wrote in 95 AD. So all that's to say that God has been giving us prophecies, specific prophecies about the end times for even at the time of John, 2,600 years, I mean, our day would be 2,600, and his day would be 600 years earlier. So in Daniel 2, there's certain chapters in Daniel that really cause us to study them and understand how they fit into the Revelation. Daniel chapter 2 is the golden image of Nebi. I always remember Veggie Tales. They had King Nebi. I thought that was funny. For those of you who don't watch Veggie Tales, our kids used to watch them all the time. Anyway, it's a cartoon type thing. But anyway, so King Nebi built this image, Nebuchadnezzar, and it was a giant image, and that image foretold the future. And the future was in the image was a head of gold, upper body of silver, stomach brass, and legs of iron, and then feet of iron and clay. And a great stone would come down and destroy the image at the end of time. And that was a stone not cut with hands, which is Messiah. And you say, well, how does that relate to Daniel? Well, because at the very end in Revelation, we're going to see that there's going to be a 10 nation, I prefer to call it 10 area zone ruling power. Antichrist is going to set up 10 zones of the world. And sometimes they're called 10 horns, sometimes they're called 10 toes, but the relationship is clear. So in other words, John, when he got his vision, he didn't have some bad pizza, was dreaming this stuff up. He wasn't trying to reiterate the previous prophets. He was giving a direct message from God, from Jesus personally in chapter 1. We studied chapter 2 and 3, the church age history, and then 4 and 5 over the last semester. And now we're going to be going into chapter 6, but I'm laying some groundwork. So how many people were here last semester? Yes, we have quite a few folks, and I'm sure we will be having additional people. Some people, it takes like a week for them to realize we're back in meeting, and make it over here. So I'm expecting more folks next week. And then in chapter 7, Daniel chapter 7, he talks about 4 beasts that he saw in a vision. And these 4 beasts deal with the worldwide kingdoms that would come on the earth before the Antichrist. And the final beast, the 4th beast, corresponds to the beast of Revelation. And that beast had horns, and those horns correspond to the 10 nations that will be, in the end times. And I probably will try to correct myself. When I say nations, typically people have talked about 10 nations, but I believe now from further study that the Antichrist is going to divide the earth into 10 zones, and we'll get into that in chapter 13. So I think it's beyond just, what should we say, country concepts, Canada is not one of the Antichrist kingdoms. Okay, United States is not one of them, but there's going to be zones, and we'll study that. For example, a zone would probably be one zone would be Mexico, United States, and Canada. That's an entity. So they're already doing that in trade, by the way. And then Daniel 8, the 4 horns, and this one is talking about another futuristic prophecy. When Alexander the Great died, he had 4 generals, and they carved up his kingdom, worldwide kingdom. Of course, when we say worldwide, it just means the Mediterranean and general areas. We're never talking about China. And you go, well, why aren't we talking about Russia or China or wherever? That's because all Bible prophecy is centered on the Jews and Israel. China has had many empires and kingdoms, but they're not relevant to Bible prophecy because it's not affecting the Jews. All prophecy is about the Jews. Anyway, yeah, so we've moved to a different classroom, and thankfully the TV is working today. So as we go on here about the Alexander kingdom being split up, it says in a prophetic reference that the last one of his generals that have a kingdom are ultimately going to have a little horn come out. Of the 4 horns, there's a little horn. And oftentimes Antichrist is spoken of as the little horn of Daniel. So we're going to see in chapter 13 of Revelation when we get there that that is the little horn. Antichrist is the little horn. And so don't get bogged down in the details. I'm just giving you something that you can look at when you have some time here. And my wife is going to send out the PDF of these slides, so you should be able to pick them. Right, so everybody can pull those up and go back over this if you have the time in our busy lives. Week 70, chapter 9 is probably the most important as far as it gives us a timeline. Nowhere else in the scripture previously, before the prophets, before Daniel's time, the exilic prophets. And by the way, Daniel and Ezekiel were exilic prophets. What that means simply is they went into exile. Babylon overtook the southern kingdom and brought them into slavery. And remember Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego? and Daniel, four of them, those are four, there are many more, were taken into exile in Babylon. So we call that the exilic uh, prophet. And so when they went there, they were given Isaiah is an exception, by the way, but of the ones who went there, several were given these visions and given, well, shouldn't say given, they became their own books, right? We have their books in the Bible. And so we have in the 70 weeks prophecy, Daniel chapter 9 is probably the most important of all the things I've talked about so far because it gives us an exact timetable. Most people don't realize that there's over 300 prophecies of Christ's first coming. And you have to say to yourself, well, how did they miss it? Well, it's quite easy. They although they had studied the prophets, of course, and the Pentateuch, Tanakh, all the Jewish writings, for many years. There had been 400 years since Malachi where there were no prophetic visions, and so can you imagine that today? It's like, if we had, our country was founded in 1776 and there was no new laws and no new word for the last 400 years. It's hard in our country, it's hard to imagine because nothing is old. Everything here is new, relatively speaking. So we we have the case where Jesus came and he came on the exact day of the prophecy. Most people don't know this. I know this is a study of Revelation, but I would be amiss if I didn't teach you that all these prophecies from the past were fulfilled. It's not a matter that they were close. He fulfilled them exactly. So, in fact, I was saved reading a book on prophecy, and I know most of you might think I'm a dinosaur now. 1973, 73. We had a great read in that book. Okay, yeah. So yeah, it was way back there. Yeah, back then I had all my teeth. It was good days. But thank God for a good dentist and Cerex and all the crowns they make today. Okay, so I lost track of how many teeth I really have, the originals. We don't even want to go there. But the whole idea is that, I've been studying this for a long time. And I started off studying these prophecies of the first coming. So over 300 prophecies, and I can't go through them all. But we know that number one, he was born in Bethlehem, prophesied. Remember, King Herod wanted to ask, where is he to be born? He knew that prophecy, at least his wise men knew the prophecy and told him. Where's he going to grow up? He shall be called a Nazarene. Okay, he grew up in Nazareth. And I can just go on and on. He's a light to the Gentiles, which is he did. He spoke truth to not just the Jews, but the Gentiles. And most importantly, and if you have a chance to read Isaiah 53, it's another name for that is the bad conscience of the synagogues. Isaiah 53 describes exactly how he died. You say, well, that's no big deal. They probably rewrote that. No, that was written by David. I mean, a lot corresponding to Psalm 22. David wrote the same thing 1,000 years before Jesus was born. Nobody rewrote it. And then you go, well, there's some other explanation. Not really, because it talks, and even if you just look at Isaiah, Isaiah was written 700 years before Jesus was born. Again, can anybody imagine what was here in the United States 700 years ago? I don't think so. That's like sci-fi thinking, all we had here is Native Americans wandering around, and we don't even know for sure what was here 700 years ago. But the key is this, that it says he's going to be crucified between two thieves and that he's going to be buried with a rich man. Is that what happened? It's exactly what happened. But we got a real problem here because it said he's going to be crucified, nailed. There's a problem. Who were the first people to crucify anybody? The Romans. So when did the Romans come into Judea? A couple decades before Jesus was born. like a thousand years after David and 700 years after Isaiah's prophecy. So before the Romans invented crucifixion and using nails, Isaiah 700 years before predicted it exactly as it happened. So, our faith is not a blind faith. It's very intellectually sustainable. It's verifiable. And you can say, oh, well, some people say, oh, Isaiah changed all that. Well, you could have said that before the fall of 1948. In the fall of 1948, in a empty, archaic uh, uh, settlement, nobody lived there, on the Dead Sea called Qumran. It was probably the settlement of the Essenes who had disappeared thousands of years before. A Bedouin boy was looking for his lost goat, and he threw a rock in a cave, and he heard it hit something. It happened to be a jar. So he climbed up there, and he went in, and he found all these jars full of old scrolls. And then he pulled the one out and went down into Jerusalem, up into Jerusalem, and he tried to sell it to an antique dealer. Miraculously, God had it go to the Hebrew scholar, one of the Hebrew scholars, who said, "This is the scroll of Isaiah." And today you can go to Israel and Jerusalem. They have a huge shrine called the Dome of the Scroll, and they have the entire thing of Isaiah. That scroll was written probably 200 years before Jesus was born. And guess what? It hasn't changed a bit compared to what we have today and what they found from 2000, 200 years ago. Same exact thing. Nobody ever changed it. So people out of ignorance in the past have said, oh, these things, they've changed the word. They haven't changed anything. God has the last laugh. So that's true almost every biblical archaeological discovery. Places they used to say, like in the 800s, 1800s, that place never existed. Now the biblical archaeologists have discovered, yes. And they said, Pilate, oh, there was no such guy as Pilate. They found a big commemoration stone at the time of Jesus, dated to the time of Jesus, says Pilate did this. I mean, there's everything that they say could not have happened. They're now discovering one by one. They're there and they're accurate. The Bible is 100% accurate. So, the people who were able to pull the wool over our eyes in the past, so-called intelligent PhD people, they were the fools. They didn't know what they're talking about. Unfortunately, education doesn't make you smart. It just means you manage to get through a certain curriculum. I should say it doesn't give you common sense. I think from what I've read over time, the people with the most PhDs sometimes have the least common sense. So that's just the way it is. I mean, education is great. I have several degrees, but it didn't make me any smarter, by the way. I wish it did. I was hoping, but the wife tells me all the time, "Boy, that's dumb." She's all, "What you did is dumb." Okay, so I have to be humbled, right, Wilfred? I know Lee wouldn't do that, but let's see what we have here. So anyway, Jeremiah's prophecy, it gave us what we call the 70 weeks prophecy. And the 70 weeks in the Hebrew, it's Shavuot. And in the Greek, it's Ebdumas. I'm just relating that. Those words each mean, so it's clear, they mean a week when you look them up. If you have a lexicon or whatever, you look them up, but they're translated a week. So in a prophetic sense, the 70 weeks are the prophecies of how many prophetic weeks. And a prophetic week is 7 years, universally understood. So in his prophecy in Daniel 9:27, it talks about that the Messiah would come, that he would be, there would be a week that he'd be cut off, I should say. He would come, there'd be a situation where he's cut off, which means he's killed. And then that there's going to be a week in the future. We know now in the distant future from his time. So 500 years later, he's Messiah. We can interpret it and look back. So he's going to come and he's going to be cut off. And then it doesn't give us the church age. It just states that in the future, there's going to be a week, 7-year period where the Antichrist is going to come in the middle of the week. The middle is the 3.5 years in, just like Daniel said earlier. There's going to be a situation where the Antichrist is killed himself. And we'll get into that in depth in chapter 13 later on, hopefully in this semester, if not next semester, since we have an ongoing yearly dissertation. Okay. And if you have any questions, please let me know. If not now, you can afterwards come on up. So what we see is that the exact time of the Messiah's coming was predicted by Isaiah, because he said there will be 70 weeks, 70 times 7, 490 weeks determined from a particular edict. And we know that's the Edict of Artaxerxes that is recorded in Nehemiah. I believe it's 10:2. So when that edict went forth, and we know it as a historical event today, then you could count on the prophetic calendar 490 prophetic years. And at that point in time is when Jesus came into Jerusalem riding on a donkey, a foal, whatever, into Jerusalem. We call that event, and we celebrate it every year. We call that event Palm Sunday. Okay, so they're all waving branches and he's coming in. Well, that exact time was predicted. If people had taken the time and were really observing it, they would have realized the time of their visitation. I think Jesus was alluding to that when he said, how could you not know the time of your visitation? And I think he was talking about this, not directly, but indirectly, that they were given the timing. So, concerning the timing of the second coming and the rapture, we're not given the exact time. But the first coming, the exact time was actually known. Very few people realize that. And so what we have is Jesus' many prophecies being fulfilled from the book of Daniel, but they weren't all totally unveiled. They were not shown forth to us. They are not given to us in detail on purpose. In Daniel chapter 11, we have the historically fulfilled events, which are things that we know. In other words, it's things that are historical events that we can look at and know. So that can be a little confusing until you realize in Daniel chapter 11, it's really divided into two sections. The first part up to verse 35, 11:35, all that's historical. And then you jump into the future, things that never happened in history. And that's talking about the Antichrist. And that is one of the places, by the way, where we see that he's going to suffer a mortal wound. But we have that also in chapter 13 of Revelation that we'll get to. Daniel chapter 12 is more in depth. It is the illumination and the delineation of what we're studying in terms of the timeline and what we can know. It says in verse 1, 12:1, a time like no other. Okay, so the tribulation will definitely be that time. If you read through chapters 6 through 19, which is where we're beginning, in Revelation, you'll see some of the most horrible judgments, not some of them, the most horrible judgments that have ever occurred on the earth. So it will be definitely a time like no other. Verse 4, it says, knowledge and transportation exponentially increased. Okay, looking at the general terms of it, it basically says people are going to increase their travel and knowledge will increase drastically. Well, isn't that what we have? We're watching this historical thing and aviation and all that, and I realized about the time I was born, we were still traveling in propeller planes, okay? But a little after I got a little older, a preteen, whatever, jets were the thing. In fact, they gave the rich people a name that you had to be rich to fly jets. The jet set. It became a big deal. Jet setters. Those were the wealthy and the celebrities and all that. So what I'm saying is, in all of history, transportation, it was a very slow process. In other words, Paul Revere rode a horse in the Revolutionary War, Washington, all the rest of them. Well, what was revolutionary about that? Nothing. The Romans rode horses for 2,000, almost 2,000 years or more. They'd been riding horses, probably more than that. So nothing had changed. So when people might make the statement back then, well, oh, has anything changed? They'd have to say, no, not really. Yeah, the ships were bigger and packed more guns, but they had ships. The Egyptians had ships. So in other words, what has happened to us is an exponential increase, as Daniel predicted in 12:4, that we have experienced in our lifetime. And what's happening now is way beyond anything that I could have imagined. When I was in high school, I used to subscribe to Scientific American because I was a science geek. And I remember reading an article and discussing it with one of my fellows. Something in there about a thing called a laser. And then they went through a whole article of how they could, basically compress light and send it like a solid beam way, way away. And so I thought, yeah, that's science fiction stuff. That's Star Trek stuff. That'll never happen. Well, then a few years later, when I'm out living in California, I'm in Calvary Chapel, Thousand Oaks, and Chuck Smith, who's the one who started Calvary Chapel. He's the featured in the movie Jesus Revolution, if you saw that last year. So, but Chuck Smith came out and talked. We're like a very small little Calvary Chapel satellite church. And he came out and talked, and he mentioned this. And he said, by the way, you can go into the valley out there. That's the San Fernando Valley. They just call it the valley. Go into the valley, and I can't remember which, I think it was Ralph's or one of those Western food chains. He says, and they actually have a laser coming up from there reading what you're buying. I said, no way. Chuck, well, you're a man of God. You can't be lying to us like that. Well, sure enough, I checked it out. They have a red beam was coming up from there. Well, that was the year 1979. Okay, so from like the mid 60s, I first read the Scientific American article until I finally saw my first laser. It wasn't that long, was it? Things are going way faster now. We'll be talking about like AI. That's all to say that knowledge and transportation is greatly increased, way beyond anything. My father, of course, he's a lot older when he had me. My father saw the first automobile come into his little town. He saw a man walk on the moon. Tell me that's not dramatic escalation of knowledge and transportation. And now I remember 1967, not to date myself, being in one of my classes, and they mentioned a new series coming on TV called Star Trek, and so everybody wanted to watch that. Uh, you probably can't imagine now that that was a big deal, but back then it was. And the teacher said, "Oh yeah, it's really good." And so I watched that, and the Captain Kirk character, he had a communicator, and he'd flip it down and talk on it. I'm going, oh yeah, like that's ever going to happen. Guess what? I think by at least by 1997, 30 years later, we had that, and now everybody has it. I'm passing homeless people on the street. They got a phone. How is that possible? Well, I'm just saying God has predicted it, and it's happened exactly as he predicted in the terms of the rapid acceleration. So does that tell us we're getting closer to the end times? You betcha. Yes, it does. The tribulation is going to be 3.5 years, the great tribulation. And so Daniel mentions that in verse 7 of chapter 12. And in verse 9, he's given the order to seal it up. Keep in mind that all this he's seen a lot more, but he said, seal it up, don't tell anybody. So who was then given to understand what Daniel was told to seal up? If Daniel was told to seal it up, what prophet in the distant future would be given the same details and information to unseal? John. So what do we call the unsealing? We call it the apocalypsis in Greek, which is our English word, Anglo word, apocalypse. So John was given the apocalypse. Some people call it that. Yeah, but that should be the actual title of it, the apocalypse of Jesus, not of John. But we're going to go further into that. And then it talks about an abomination. I can cover that much later, but it talks about some additional days. But the point that I'm trying to bring to you, and I'll have to finish up next time, is that all these ancient prophets so long ago were given details of what's happening or going to happen now. And they all go right into Revelation. So when you study Revelation, you're getting the benefit of all those prophets before and the verification that what they predicted is accurate. So how do we know that Jesus is the Lord? Well, of course, you have the Holy Spirit. So you don't necessarily have to know prophecy, but I'm saying if you have the Lord and know prophecy, your faith will be even stronger, because it's not some mindless blind faith thing that they try to accuse us of. It's because they're ignorant of fulfilled prophecy. I'm talking about secular PhDs. Because they're ignorant doesn't mean I'm ignorant or we are ignorant. So I'm going to leave it off at that because we're at the top of the hour. Honey?